Buenos días a todos y a todas. Me llamo Carlos Sanz, soy el director del Departamento de Historia Moderna e Historia Contemporánea y en calidad de esta función me cabe el honor de abrir este seminario, este congreso internacional con unas palabras, por lo cual quiero agradecer en primer lugar a la profesora Giulia Quaggio y a Verónica García Martín por la invitación a realizar esta apertura y acogida del congreso. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everybody, especially those who travel from abroad, from far away. Gracias a los que habéis venido y en especial os habéis desplazado desde mayores distancias. En épocas y en tiempos en que hay universidades o gobiernos que tratan de hacer de las universidades cotos cerrados y lugares de confrontación y cerrar la circulación del conocimiento y de las personas, quiero recordar la última estrofa del himno de la universidad, no de la Universidad Complutense, sino de todas las universidades. El Gaudeamus Igitur dice en sus últimos versos: florezca el alma mater que nos ha educado y ha reunido a los queridos compañeros que por regiones alejadas estaban dispersos. Es de verdad un honor no solo inaugurar, sino también hablar como director del departamento, o expresar el apoyo del departamento y especialmente del área de Historia Contemporánea a las iniciativas de nuestro profesorado, de nuestros investigadores contratados, puesto que es un departamento que realmente es muy activo y especialmente lo es a través de los grupos de investigación, y aquí quiero mencionar en concreto el grupo de investigación Expe Historia, Ideas, Saberes y Experiencias, a la cual que también apoya este seminario. Y continuando con unas palabras institucionales, creo que también hablo en calidad de titular de la cátedra Jean Monnet de Historia de Europa y de la Integración Europea, la cátedra ISTEU, que tenemos en esta facultad y de cuyo equipo forma parte la profesora Giulia Quaggio. Desde la cátedra Jean Monnet nos ocupamos de dar docencia, investigación y hacer transferencia a la sociedad de conocimiento sobre la historia de la integración europea y sobre Europa, conocimiento crítico, conocimiento para formar una ciudadanía informada, y qué duda cabe que dentro del proyecto de integración europea y de su historia está el proyecto o la vertiente de Europa como un proyecto de paz basado en la reconciliación de las naciones europeas que durante siglos se combatieron en los campos de batalla. Voy a terminar mi breve alocución. Es obvio que el tema de la paz es de actualidad. Hay que hablar de paz más que nunca, hay que hablar de historia de la paz y del activismo por la paz en España y en Europa. Y para terminar quiero citar otros dos versos del Gaudeamus Igitur que creo que reflejan bien nuestra actividad intelectual y también el hábitus universitario. Estos dos versos dicen así, cita: muera la tristeza, muera los que odian. Sí, fin de la cita. Puede ser un poco quizá fuerte, pero quiero leerlo en clave positiva, o viendo el reverso: viva la alegría, vivan los que conversan, los que se reúnen para crear conocimiento, no sé si decir en fraternidad, pero al menos en armonía. Muchas gracias.
Buenos días a todas y todos. Good morning to everybody. Es la verdad un gran placer y os agradezco de verdad por estar aquí y enviaros vuestro texto, vuestras propuestas, y seguro hoy será un día que vamos, por lo menos yo seguro, aprender mucho de todas vuestras intervenciones. Entonces os agradezco de corazón por también los que van llegando poco a poco, por estar aquí y dedicar vuestro precioso tiempo y esfuerzo al proyecto ICARIS, que se puede ver también en la pantalla, que es un proyecto financiado por los fondos de resiliencia de la Unión Europea y el Ministerio de Innovación español, como podéis ver en los logos que están abajo, sobre los marcos culturales de las protestas por la paz. En particular, agradezco al profesor Holger Nehring por llegar aquí desde Escocia y con un cambio climático, me estaba comentando, más bien importante. De hecho, en Sheffield eran 10 grados, es decir, un cambio de 20 grados. Y también aumentar todos nuestro conocimiento desde el enfoque de sus estudios pioneros sobre movilizaciones por la paz en Europa. Quisiera también agradecer de forma particular a la Facultad de Geografía e Historia por permitirnos reunirnos en este espacio tan grande, pero agradable, y a la cátedra Jean Monnet dirigida por Carlos Sanz, que también es el querido director de nuestro departamento, que la verdad es siempre disponible y intelectualmente muy abierto, y esa es una calidad muy importante en estos tiempos a toda nuestra propuesta. Y por lo tanto agradecemos de verdad a Carlos. Agradezco también a los grupos de investigación GISTRI sobre historia de las relaciones internacionales, dirigido por el profesor Juan Carlos Pereira, y, como comentaba antes Carlos Sanz, el grupo ESPE Historia, dirigido por la profesora Carolina Rodríguez López. También, digamos, este proyecto ha sido posible, evidentemente, gracias a todos estos fondos, pero si efectivamente estamos avanzando y estamos consiguiendo algunos resultados, es gracias a los miembros de este pequeño proyecto y investigadores postdoctorales, es decir, Verónica, García, Martín, que luego irá introduciendo también sus pioneras investigaciones, Xavier María Ramos Díaz Astrain, que seguro a lo largo del día vais apreciando cuánto son rompedoras, groundbreaking, sus investigaciones y cuánto están aportando a ese proyecto. También la verdad es que tengo el privilegio de tener con nosotras y nosotros en ICARIS a Carmen Menchero de los Ríos como experta en humanidades digitales, que está implementando, espero ahora vaya todo bien, ¿no? Lo podemos ver, esta preciosa página web, a ver si la podemos abrir aquí. Aquí hay todo el equipo y la página. Entonces, que incluye, esto sí es muy importante, numerosos datos en abierto. Como podéis ver, hay de hecho una exposición virtual con varios materiales gráficos de las protestas del principio, a ver, murales, por ejemplo, panfletos de las protestas anti-OTAN y por la paz de principios de los años 80. También tenemos testimonios y entrevistas en abierto de distintos activistas y, sobre todo, vuelvo atrás, esta página es una página abierta a la colaboración de la ciudadanía y que aspira a adquirir archivos privados de personas que quieren que sus informaciones, sus recuerdos, sus experiencias vitales puedan también llegar a un público más amplio y a los investigadores y a las investigadoras. El proyecto ICARIS se enmarca, como sabemos, en el amplio y variado campo de estudios sobre la historia de la paz. Osbaum en 2013 llegó a decir que el mundo entero nunca estuvo en paz desde 1914 y no está en paz ahora. Las dos guerras mundiales, la Guerra Fría, dominaron el siglo XX y tampoco el final del conflicto bipolar abrió, como bien sabéis, una etapa de paz. Con las tensiones geopolíticas y multipolares de la actualidad en Gaza y la invasión rusa en Ucrania, la cuestión de la guerra, del rearme europeo, de la defensa europea y, desafortunadamente, en menor medida de la paz, han vuelto a la palestra pública. Por eso, todos nosotros y nosotras creemos que un proyecto sobre las definiciones y conceptualizaciones de paz en España y en Europa, más en general o a nivel global, es más que oportuno hoy en día. No es una coincidencia, de hecho, que la mayoría de las publicaciones históricas sobre Europa contemporánea en el siglo XX se enfoquen sobre todo en la historia de los conflictos, prestando relativamente menos atención a las prácticas de peace building. Para los historiadores y las historiadoras es sin duda complejo, como veremos a lo largo de estos 2 días, dar sentido a la historia de la paz. Los estudios sobre la historia de la paz coinciden, por lo tanto, en afirmar que la idea de paz no aparece de forma automática ni puede interpretarse exclusivamente como ausencia de la guerra. Las formas en las que las personas reaccionan a las distintas experiencias de guerra tienen un efecto directo sobre la idea de paz, que se va moldeando en cada etapa histórica de forma distinta. El uso extensivo, además, del término paz en la esfera pública hace aún más difícil intentar definir qué es la paz. A lo largo del siglo XX, como también en la actualidad, la mayoría de las grandes acciones militares se llevaron a cabo en nombre de la paz. Fascistas, socialistas o demócratas, de manera similar pero muy diferente, se apropiaron del lenguaje de la paz para sus fines políticos. En otras palabras, a lo largo del siglo XX hubo una extensa politización del concepto de paz que no siempre favoreció su realización. A partir de todas estas consideraciones sobre la idea de paz como un pensamiento débil y esquivo, para utilizar la expresión del filósofo italiano Vattimo, la historiografía se está enfocando y se ha enfocado desde el siglo pasado en trazar la experiencia y también el recorrido histórico de las personas que se involucraron en todas estas cuestiones difíciles y en definir las peculiaridades espaciales, culturales y sociales de ese activismo. Según Benjamin Zimmerman, los movimientos por la paz pueden definirse como movimientos sociales que tienen como objetivo protestar contra los peligros percibidos con respecto a las decisiones políticas relacionadas con los armamentos. Desde el inicio de las primeras organizaciones por la paz en el siglo XIX, se vislumbraron, por lo tanto, numerosas fisuras alrededor del concepto de paz. Como explica el historiador Seattle, debe hacerse una distinción, por lo tanto, analítica entre el pacifismo, que rechaza tanto la guerra como la apoya a la guerra, y el pacificismo, que busca reformar el sistema internacional y rechaza las guerras agresivas, pero que también subraya la justificación de la defensa militar contra un agresor extranjero. Otra historiadora, Cooper, también introduce la idea de un pacifismo patriótico. El análisis, por lo tanto, de los movimientos por la paz permite ampliar nuestro marco interpretativo histórico sobre las relaciones internacionales y generar interesantes conexiones entre políticas nacionales y política exterior. En otras palabras, estudiar la historia de los movimientos por la paz nos da pistas interesantes sobre el concepto de seguridad, que no solo fue una categoría clave de las acciones gubernamentales, sino que también representa un amplio horizonte de expectativas por parte de la gente común. El estudio de las divergentes nociones de seguridad ayuda a apreciar las relaciones internacionales desde abajo, pero también a ponerla en conexión con las políticas de bienestar social y los procesos de democratización, extendiendo o matizando ideas consolidadas sobre ciudadanía y abriendo, por lo tanto, camino para una comprensión más inclusiva y equitativa de la participación política de las masas. A raíz de estas consideraciones, dejo la palabra a Verónica García Martín, que os va a detallar cómo hemos planeado estos días.
Buenos días a todos y a todas. Good morning, everyone. Buongiorno a tutti, por el colectivo también italiano que tenemos. En primer lugar, pues quería agradecer a todo el mundo su asistencia e interés en el Congreso y, por supuesto, haberse desplazado en muchos de los casos a Madrid para intervenir, ¿no? Realmente estamos muy contentas del resultado porque las propuestas pues, nos han permitido observar previamente, lo iremos viendo durante estos días, ¿no?, que es un tema que genera mucho interés y desde diferentes perspectivas. Es un fenómeno multidimensional y a diferentes geografías y cronologías dentro del siglo XX, ¿no? El tema de la historia de la paz no es nuevo ni mucho menos y por eso también recogemos un poco el guante y como la honestidad también debe ser uno de los principios fundamentales de todo historiador e historiadora, pues es de honestidad citar iniciativas que han antecedido también a esta, ¿no? Como por ejemplo la que organizó Laura Branciforte, que está con nosotras en 2023, de Mujeres para la Paz entre guerras y resistencia civil en el siglo XX, libros colectivos como El pacifismo en España desde 1808 hasta El no a la guerra de Irak, en el que también participan muchos de los aquí presentes. U otras iniciativas que están por venir, como la mesa que va a coordinar otra de las investigadoras que nos acompañará a lo largo del día de hoy en el Congreso del HC, que es Sandra Blasco, junto con Jara Cuadrado, que va a presentar una mesa taller que se titula El papel de las mujeres en los procesos de construcción de paz. En fin, el tema de la paz estamos viendo que es algo fértil, y algo que no sé, todavía queda mucho por descubrir. Hay que meter el bisturí y sacar esas diferentes definiciones del concepto de paz, los agentes que se involucraron en esta construcción del marco de paz. Y encima es en un contexto que parece que nos grita, ¿no?, que estudiemos estos temas desde una perspectiva histórica, pues para comprender, como lo que siempre decimos, ¿no?, para comprender el presente, pero sobre todo para imaginar el futuro, ¿no? Queríamos conocer pues, cuáles son las aportaciones que se están trabajando actualmente y también explorar esa faceta internacional, global, transnacional, ¿no?, que es fundamental en el activismo por la paz. Y es uno de los ingredientes clave, yo creo, que vamos a ver a lo largo de todas las intervenciones, a lo largo del día de hoy y también de mañana. Y también, pues, por supuesto, seguir construyendo un diálogo en torno a este tema, también con generaciones que somos más jóvenes, otros con más experiencia también en el campo de esta investigación. Y partimos de la base de que, bueno, estábamos muy interesadas en examinar los procesos altamente dinámicos de negociación y contestación de las formas y definiciones pues, históricamente específicas de la paz. Y partimos, por tanto, de que el término de paz no es ni mucho menos estable, sino que es constantemente negociado, ¿no? Y esa negociación creemos también que es algo fundamental y que veremos a lo largo de todos los textos que nos habéis presentado ya. Como digo, creo que vamos a ver lo específico de esta negociación y los diferentes agentes que intervienen en ella, teniendo en cuenta diferentes pues, geografías y temporalidades y, por supuesto, ese factor, como decía, transnacional o internacional. Así tendremos a continuación la ponencia inaugural del profesor Holger Nehring de la Universidad de Stirling, que nos proporcionará pues, un marco excepcional sobre los movimientos por la paz en Europa para abrir el Congreso. Y a continuación pues, tendremos la primera mesa que hemos titulado Activismo, Resistencia y Redes por la Paz, donde se proponen pues, diferentes cronologías de resistencia y lucha por la paz. La segunda, que será la primera por la tarde, ¿no? Que se denomina Paz y Humanitarismo antes de la Guerra Civil, en la que pues, nos encontramos cómo se modulan estos conceptos en el primer tercio del siglo XX, junto con otros movimientos como el feminismo, el anarquismo o el antifascismo. La tercera, Culturas políticas de la paz en España, que será la última de esta tarde, en la que se abordarán diferentes perspectivas en las que se incluyen pues, comunistas, socialistas, católicos y católicas. La cuarta, y ya la madrugadora de la mañana, será la paz e integración de España en la OTAN, teniendo como eje vertebral las discusiones y debates fundamentales que hubo en España en los años 80. Y, por último, la mesa de la paz en clave global, donde exploraremos, pues como vengo insistiendo en esta breve introducción, ¿no? La esencia del concepto de paz, ¿no? que necesariamente tiene que ser internacional. Así que doy paso de nuevo a Giulia para que presente a Holger, por mi parte.
Okay, I'm going to speech language to introduce you. It's a truly great honor to have Professor Holger Nehring here with us today. I'm not exaggerating when I say that he's one of the main sources of inspiration for this project on the cultural frames of peace mobilization in the 80s from a comparative perspective. Professor Nehring's academic career is undoubtedly outstanding. So before joining Stirling Division of History and Politics in 2013, he was based in various positions at the University of Sheffield. He holds a PhD from Oxford University. He's an historian of post-1945 Western Europe with special interest in the history of social movements, protests, and political activism in Britain and West Germany, the history of violence and peace, the history of subnational diplomacy, and the Cold War museology. He worked in different projects at SPI that examine the role of infrastructure for NATO in the Cold War, transatlantic debates about burden sharing in the Alliance. He works on the history also of science diplomacy in the Cold War, and especially the punk-wash movement. He held a number of visiting research fellowships in all Europe and North America, for instance, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, the Merchant Center for International Security Studies, or Stanford. He is the co-director of the Research Center for Policy, Conflict and Cooperation and co-editor of Pilgrim Studies in the History of Social Movements and co-editor for Bengal Books in Study in Civil Society. Some of his outstanding publications are here, and I prepare a PowerPoint here that I'm going to put better. No, here. So you have some of his publications. For instance, the edited book Cold War Museology, Politics of Security, British and West German protest movement and the early Cold War, or, for instance, the history of social movements in global perspective. So many thanks, Professor Nehring, to be with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Giulia, for this very kind introduction, and to you and to Verónica for the excellent organization, and for inviting me to give this keynote. And after your introduction, it can only go downhill, so the pressure is on now for me to deliver on the promises that that have been made, and I'll try my best. And it's actually great to see the vibrancy of this field of peace history here in Madrid. but perhaps also generally, because when I started my PhD, there was one older professor at Oxford who talked to me after a seminar paper and who said, "Isn't what you're doing just journalism?" Because it was post-45 history, and because it was basically something that, for him, at the time, was something that was still very present, and therefore it didn't really need to be dealt with by historians. But there's a different discussion there about what contemporary history is. Now, on the 23rd of May, 1984, the British historian and anti-nuclear activist E.P. Thompson addressed a gathering in Barcelona for a sort of peace mobilization event against Spain's NATO membership, the Jornada sobre el peligro de guerra nuclear y las alternativas pacifistas. In his address, he called for the immediate intervention and rapid deployment against NATO. So it's interesting already how he uses military language to refer to peace activism. And to end Europe's civil war with what he called the same maturity that the Spanish people used to bring an end to the Francoist regime. Without a second civil war, the one he means is the one 1936 to 1939, you have, he told his Spanish audience, the opportunity to become a principal actor among non-aligned states, a mediator between East and West, and between Europe and the Third World. Will Spain be managed by the superpowers through its NATO membership, or will it be converted into an actor of its own right, an agent of history, and in the midst of the crisis of humanity, find a third way towards peace? He asked. Now, this is interesting because it shows how he connected historical memories to peace activism. But it also shows a very peculiar perspective that Thompson brought on to peace activism and peace campaigning in the 1980s, which was actually quite controversial among peace activists, but also more generally. And what's also notable is that Thompson was probably not a pacifist, but he was more in a sort of space of socialist anti-militarism and post-communism. But he was pronouncedly not a pacifist who called for non-violence at all times, and his kind of military language suggests this. There could probably not be a better time than these days to discuss peace movements under the heading of fragile utopia. I've seen comments in the German press that actually evoked the Spanish Civil War now, but not as something that asks for civil society mobilization towards peace, but as an argument in favor of mobilizing European societies and economies for war, namely as a legacy of, in a sense, not losing the Civil War for the Republican side, but actually winning in the battle against Russian fascism. Again, a very interesting mobilization of European history and memory. Indeed, peace has been a fragile utopia in, I can say, at least two ways. One, because the utopia itself has always been fragile. Peace has best been achieved as a future not yet realized, as an expectation rather than a state of affairs. And both Verónica and Giulia mentioned this just now in their introductions as well. But peace itself as a practice and as an ideal has often been fragile and contested as well. It's not quite clear what peace is and how it can be achieved, and no one has perhaps debated this as much as peace movements themselves and peace activists themselves. And as the husband of a 1980s peace activist told me, there was always war in our house because of my wife's peace activism, which is also an interesting statement for a number of reasons, also sort of the gender dynamics of this. So peace as a fragile utopia is also interesting because it's literally the non-place that utopia is, because it doesn't really have a proper place in society. And this is, I think, also what explains that it's so long been absent from some scholarship that actually integrates it within broader scopes of European history and usually isolates peace movements against other actors and sees them as somehow distinct. I just want to start by showing you a number of different images of peace as fractured or not fractured. So here we see the campaign for nuclear disarmament sign with a crack in the middle. Here we can see this is actually a bit of cheating because this is from 1914 from the United States, but I thought the image was quite interesting in terms of the symbolism with the white dove, and also because of the gender dimension that's portrayed here. This is just at the outbreak of the First World War in a New York peace demonstration. Then this is also interesting. This is from Germany, and it appeals to mothers to actually campaign against war loans in Germany. And you can see here the symbolism that we saw in some of the graffiti as well, the kind of skulls, and then the children have turned into soldiers, dead soldiers essentially. And this is a symbolism that carries on into the 1950s in Germany and then also into other contexts. Here, this is a famous Käthe Kollwitz sketch, No More War. So this is, again, is a completely different image of almost heroic resistance against war. This comes out of the context of the War Resisters International, so an anti-militarist movement, not a pacifist movement, that's kind of linked to broader socialist groupings across Europe in the 1920s. And then we have this, which is from a communist poster, and their model for achieving peace is to get rid of the rubble and to kick it into the moat. And this is the proud communist peace fighter, but of course this communist peace fighter is also a violent campaigner and soldier. And then I've just to close, this is a take by Georges Braque on the dove, Picasso's famous dove in blue and white, which I thought especially appealing because it's kind of aesthetically, I think, very pleasing. But again, it remains very abstract, so we don't really know in terms of a utopia. This is kind of what peace is. Now, this question of a fragile utopia is especially relevant when we look at 20th century European history, because as the French intellectual François Bondy has said, Europe was the experimental site for the apocalypse in the 20th century because of the violence it has experienced. What I want to do in my talk is to look at the utopia of peace in an abstract fashion and to single out peace movements. What I don't want to do in my talk is to look at the utopia of peace in an abstract fashion and then single out peace movements as a harbingers for a better world that build this utopia and that try, as the sort of heroes in the story, that try to build this utopia in the present. Instead, I want to highlight some of the ways in which mobilizing for peace can be seen as part of 20th century European history, and highlight a number of key themes that I think are important. I've intentionally bypassed here some of the exciting work we're going to hear about as part of this conference, or the kind of broader context, and there's now an infinite list of topics I could have talked about that I'm not going to talk about. For example, the links between Eastern and Western European peace movements and what this has meant, the sort of history of emotions and fear in the broader sense. That's also been a very popular and rewarding topic. I'm going to talk very little about the question of gender notions of peace and peace activism. And I'm also not going to talk about transnational networks and links. Instead, what I want to do is I want to start with, because I've been asked to do that, to talk a little bit about the historiography, and then I'm going to talk about three more or less impressionistic case studies of three fields that I think are quite interesting for the reasons I'm going to talk about. The premise of my talk is that peace, like war, involves mobilization. In the case of war, mobilization is the mobilization of men, and mostly men in the 20th century, and machines towards the use of violence against others. In the case of peace, it's actually far less clear what is being mobilized and to what end and by whom, because there's always a fluctuation depending on what you mean by peace, who's involved, and how you're achieving the end. Many of the 1970s terrorists saw themselves in the end as peace activists because they saw their terrorism, their resistance against the state, their anarchism as a way to achieve a non-violent society. So this is kind of interesting, and it's far less clear than it is with war, what is being mobilized and to what end. Now, the traditional story many peace historians have told is one where the peace movement and its activists are a bunch of, in a sort of slightly flippant term, mostly idealistic do-gooders. This is then either portrayed as heroic activism or by the critics as naive, or worse, they are portrayed as fellow travelers or direct accomplices of European dictatorships. We can detect these tropes actually to the present day in discussions about Russia's war against Ukraine, where basically every single person who argues in favor of peace, regardless of the affiliation, is seen as an accomplice of Putin's Russia by the critics. This can be true, but it is not always true, and it's kind of interesting. It always depends on how you define peace and how you basically see the person who's making these statements. In those stories, peace movements stand in for either laudable or problematic features of politics in a given context. So peace activism then becomes a symbol for something else that you either agree with or disagree with. And I want to highlight two ways in which this has worked. One is in the context of histories of special paths into the modern and contemporary world. For example, in 1970s and 80s Germany, where pacifists emerged as those organizations that sought with success to halt the onward march of authoritarianism and international socialism. Research in the 1970s and 80s in Germany portrayed pacifism as the people who prevented or tried to prevent and then failed the march into National Socialism. And this is quite interesting. It's quite an interesting view because on the one hand, it rejects a sort of special German path because it says there were the good ones in German society and politics to try to prevent, but in the end, it confirms the special path because it argues they failed. A similar methodology and approach has for quite a long while also applied to the British context, which sort of confirmed a liberal or Whig interpretation of British history of constant and enlightened liberalization as the front runner in democratization and liberalization in Europe, if not the world, as the country who gave the world democracy in a way, of course, ignoring all the kind of other bits that don't fit into this, where you then get the peace movement as the embodiment of what is good about Britain. So even then the people who disagreed with the peace movement will say, oh, but we tolerated them, which shows that we are a kind of diverse and liberal society. And to some extent, this thinking in terms of special paths, of course, as some of you have pointed out in their publications, has also had an impact on scholarship on peace activism in Southern Europe in particular, so Spain, Italy, also Greece, because what's prevented research into peace activism there is the kind of idea that there was, again, a special path which was characterized by very weak civil societies and very strong states. So there was actually no space to look for when looking for peace activism, so no one actually looked. So we also have sort of special paths in European history in preventing research on peace activism. What's interesting is that in the earlier historiography, also most of these treatments of pacifism as pacifist organizations actually abruptly ended in 1945. This is even true for some of the overview works, which really then just had the post-1945 period as a coda, as if the violence of the Second World War had made pacifist organizations obsolete. And of course also then the special paths argument became much more difficult to sustain. In general then, the integration of the history of pacifism or peace movements into general European history has been somewhat fraught for a very long time. This did not only have to do with the methodologies used, but also had to do with some of the features of peace mobilizations themselves. And I want to highlight 3 of those. First, as Roger Chickering observed in his landmark study on peace movements in the political culture of the German Empire, which is from the late 1970s and which is really pioneering, and it's a great book. Given that it was written in the late 1970s, it could be written now and would still be pretty much methodologically up to date. Chickering observed peace movements were paradoxical because they were both revolutionary in terms of their aims for the international system, but they were also basically conservative in that they claimed that nothing would change domestically if they implemented their program, and they were also pretty conservative or liberally conservative in terms of their social demographic, because they were mostly composed of the male educated middle class with a few female peace activists. And this made it rather difficult to analyze them, so that organizational histories seemed best suited to do this. And Chickering then tries to actually overcome this by embedding peace organizations more generally in the political culture of the German Empire. Second, peace movements have had a bad reputation, generally speaking. First, and I already alluded to this because of their association with allegedly promoting the appeasement of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy in the 1930s. Secondly, especially during the Cold War, because of their association with communist peace campaigns in the 1920s and 1930s, but then also in the 1950s onwards, where communist peace campaigns explicitly used peace as a way to create conditions for a civil war that would then end all wars, both domestic and international. So Andreas Wirsching has highlighted in his study, comparative study on French and German communism in the interwar period, how communists basically tried to get from a situation of the World War to a situation of the Civil War. What's interesting, though, and this is usually ignored in the polemics, is, and Wirsching shows this quite well, is how actually the communist activists did not go along with that mandate. So they actually showed agency themselves, and they very often protested, very often violently as well, not when they were told to do so, but very often when they were told not to do so. The interesting thing is then also the relationship between organizations on the one hand and then the agency of the activists themselves. And very often actually the sort of violence happens when the organizational structures are relatively weak or did not have power over the activists. This is at least what Wirsching's work suggests. And so in terms of their reputation, I think very few political actors in the 20th century can claim an association with the two bad forces in European politics: fascism, National Socialism on the one hand, and communism. And then, of course, why would you research them? You would research them to basically denounce them, and that, of course, limits research quite a bit. Third, the difficulties with peace movements had a lot to do with the concept of peace as a fragile utopia. Peace was a constant expectation rather than something that had already been achieved. And as Benjamin Ziemann has quipped, the peace movement tried to sell wares or goods that it said were not available yet. So it's like having a shop, he says, that sells something and says, sorry, we are out of stock yet. You have to come back at a later time. And this is, of course, not a really good model for successful advertising or marketing. Now, despite these difficulties, historical peace research moved on. And I would highlight three contributions in particular that I think are especially important. And I think the first of these is the book Thinking About Peace and War by Martin Kiedel. And it's especially useful because it's a very traditional book. It's, in a sense, an intellectual history, as the name suggests. Kiedel himself, a historian of pacifist organizations, tried to differentiate the political and social debates about peace in the context of the debates about NATO's dual-track decision. So he tried to show that actually the campaigns by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and other actors at the time were not necessarily pacifists in the narrow sense, but tried to also communicate different goals. In particular, he emphasized that there was a spectrum of views about peace and war. It wasn't just either being pro-war or being pro-non-violence and peace, but there was a whole spectrum in between. And he said it's very important to be very specific about what people argued for. And I think, especially at the time, but also more generally for the field, this was a really important intervention, especially because it was methodologically, from today's point of view, quite conservative, because it just approached it via the intellectual history. The second landmark contribution, I think, is a volume in German, unfortunately only, by Thomas Kühne from the late 1990s on peace culture. And this is a concept he took from UNESCO, which kind of launched a number of publications trying to promote a culture of peace and peaceful conflict resolution in the 1990s. And it was very much carried by the optimism that such cultures had been established in Europe and held firm despite the ongoing wars in Yugoslavia and what became the former Yugoslavia. And so what Thomas Kühne's book does is it tries to actually get rid of some of the normative elements of the concept and try to use this to look at notions of peace in society more generally and put them into historical context. Thomas Kühne observed that war as a conscious means of politics or as a fate in international relations didn't actually hold sway anymore during the 1990s, and then he said we actually now need to historicize these views and we need to open them for historical negotiations. Likewise, the soldier as the ideal type of masculine citizen had become more controversial than ever. War, military and violence had a lower level of legitimacy. And the book then investigated this change of mentality in a number of case studies, mainly for Germany, but also some in a transnational context, where they tried to map out the transition, in Germany's case, from total war to total peace, as Gottfried Neidhardt has called it. The third major contribution that I think was really important, at least for the German context, but I think also then through a number of publications in English, was the path-breaking volume by Benjamin Ziemann on perspectives of historical peace research that tried to map out peace history as a subfield of general history rather than as an enclosed dominion of a few experts by engaging with a wide range of methodologies. The history of war and violence as well as peace had been more or less irrelevant for contemporary history, he says, until at least the 1990s, and he's right. So you couldn't find in the general overviews of European history, there was very little actually that looked at peacemaking and overcoming the violence of war. A keynote study actually was Tony Judd's post-war, but that's problematic in other ways as well. There were Mark Mazauer's Dark Continent was another landmark publication that tries to look at that. But the interesting thing is they talk very little about how the violence is overcome. And especially in Tony Judd's work, peace movements are the sort of willing executioners of communist propaganda, unless they happen to be placed in Eastern Europe, and then he develops a more positive view. But again, these kinds of developments were quite important. And Benjamin Ziemann called for a number of exercises in historically contextualizing or historicizations of a number of aspects. So first of all, the historicization of expectations of peace, but also the disappointments when these expectations did not come true. Then also the kind of putting into a proper context the concepts of peace and the people who developed them, and this is then where developed them, and this is then where peace movements came in. And in particular, he said we need to also look at the relationship between those concepts of peace to concepts of violence, and the relationship between peace and violence and memories of violence as well. And he called for moving away from heroic portrayals of peace fighters and from organizational histories of peace activism or peace organizations towards social networks and cultural symbols, and from organizations to social movements. And this is obviously especially appropriate for the post-45 period, because for the earlier period you can actually make an argument that the organizational approach is the most effective one, because they actually conceived of themselves as organizations rather than as movements, because they were driven by a very specific ideal of organizing. But especially for the post-45 period, this kind of social movement approach is probably more rewarding. So what I want to do now in the second part of my talk is map out very briefly and impressionistically 3 areas that we might want to talk about when we talk about peace in European history. And I'll start very generally with peace in European history, then move to some thoughts on conscientious objection and the politics of peace, and then finally on how peace movements have dealt with disappointments and what this has meant for peace activism and in the context of democracy. So, peace in European history more generally. In a speech to the European Parliament in 1995, the French President François Mitterrand, together with the German Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl, framed the problem of peace in European history by counterposing the grief, the pain of separation, the presence of death inflicted by the nationalist rivalries during the years 1939 to 1945, to the peace and reconciliation that European integration had brought after 1945. So we've got a very clear separation of European history into two parts. One is the history of violence, and the other one is the history of peace. It's the small matter that actually that kind of neat separation doesn't work for countries such as Spain, Portugal, and Greece, and it might not even work for some of the Central European countries either. Especially it doesn't work for Eastern European countries. So, however, this political and experiential interpretation has percolated into a lot of the self-conceptions of European integration, and it has also percolated into the views, they are now currently being revived, of international politics and national identity. Some of you might still remember the kind of polemic by Robert Kagan, who said that Americans are from Mars and Europeans are from Venus, reviving a sort of old trope that mattered also in the peace movements of the 1980s about the sort of gendered nation of peace and war. We can also see this in James Sheehan's book, Where Have All the Soldiers Gone, is the title, where he basically sketches out a very specific path of Europe towards sort of non-violent modernity, as well as Jay Winter in his long essay on Dreams of Peace and Freedom. The problem is that this is a sort of dialectic interpretation, almost Hegelian, where violence then obtains a redemptive quality. So we needed the violence of the Second World War in order to get to the peace of the Cold War, which of course wasn't a real peace. This is why I think a more promising avenue forward to conceptualize of peace in European history, and this also allows to bring peace activism in, is one that looks towards notions of democracy, or Pierre Rosanvallon's concept of the political, political not as something that is given, but political as an always contentious process in which the explicit or implicit rules of what people can share and accomplish in common are elaborated. Then we have different actors that participate in those that are very often linked, so governments, peace activists, other social groups interact. The whole process is medialized as well, so that we can highlight actually creativity rather than have sort of an approach that looks at islands of radicalism or conservatism within society. So this is my kind of general take. And I just want to highlight with one example. So this seems to have fallen asleep now. Ah, yeah. This is quite interesting because this is a screening of the film All Quiet on the Western Front, which was used by the Nazis to basically denounce what they called the Gewaltfrieden, the peace of violence of Versailles. And so there were basically literally street battles about a film that was supposed to be about peace. Of course, if you look at the original film and also at the book, it's actually surprising how violent they are. So there's, I think Benjamin Seaman has said this, and there are other studies that have actually compared Ernst Jünger's Storms of Steel with Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, and they found that the metaphors and images that are used are actually remarkably similar. It's just the political message that's communicated that's different. And that kind of suggests how productive an approach is that looks at sort of notions of the political rather than merely taking things for granted. Now, the second aspect I want to talk about is the politics of peace and movement activism, and I want to look especially at what actually the history of Southern European activism might tell us about more general trends. And specifically, I depart from, or I rely on the assumption by social movement scholars, in this case Alberto Melucci, that social action is not a given, but it's socially produced within the boundaries of certain structures. So you need cognitive, effective, and interactive relationships that then creatively transform the social action in their social environment. This is, of course, very difficult to do when you're trying to write a history. It's much easier to actually say this in this abstract social science fashion than actually to find the primary sources that allow you to do it. But I think this should be the ambition to try to achieve a sort of thick description. And some of Giulia's work and Laura's work on the peace camp have actually done that. Now here, in this context, Spain and perhaps also Greece and Italy provide us with insights that reveal trends that remain hidden elsewhere, mainly because peace activism was related not only to creating a safer, more secure world, but also to engaging directly with the legacy of dictatorship and the transition from dictatorship to democracy. So Giulia Quaggio has produced some excellent work here, urging us to rethink some of the periodization, specifically in terms of the question of whether the 1970s and 1980s formed a caesura in European history. I want to use one case study, which is a group of, going out of my comfort zone, a group of conscientious objectors in Spain, the Movimiento de Objetores de Conciencia, which was founded in 1977. And the question here is to what extent their anti-militarism reproduced the male soldier hero, just that now the male soldier hero was the conscientious objector fighting for conscientious objector. So the brave man willing to face imprisonment versus the representatives of the militarist state. But the interesting thing is that the gender discussions, from what I've seen in the literature, actually remained mostly hidden. So they weren't actually very often not explicitly talked about. And I found in Cynthia Cockburn's work, she's done some interviews with activists. She cites a woman in Sevilla in 2007 who's looking back to the 1980s, who observed, even in the face of violence, we couldn't manage to get beyond a narrow denunciation of sexism, leaving undone any deeper analysis of the meaning of militarism in the structures of patriarchal power. Nonetheless, conscientious objection in Spain is very interesting because links were established across the Mediterranean. There were some links to movements in the Western Sahara, which I find very interesting in terms of the kind, because it kind of bridges the Mediterranean in that end, but also over to a Serbian movement called Women in Black in 1991. Which itself then had links to the anti-occupation movement in Israel. And apparently that connection had been established via Italian anti-war, anti-occupation activism. So we actually have a lot of different interactions also between different movements, which is quite interesting, which is why I think the conscientious objection movement is an especially interesting case study for this kind of politics of peace activism. But there's a second aspect to this, why the kind of history of the 1970s and 80s in Southern Europe can tell us something, and this is about the relationship towards the United States as the hegemonic power in the Cold War, because it brings things out that are not as clear necessarily in other contexts. Because the Spanish peace activism in this kind of period was mostly, in a sense, for Spanish sovereignty against an American occupation. I've got some, I think, some, could you switch forward again? Yeah, so this is here, I think this is even, this might even be on the campus here of the university. This is basically an anti-NATO protest, and then if we can go to the next one, which is a, this is now a more recent one, which basically revives the kind of visual language from the 1980s for today, 75 years of still going on in the fight against NATO. And this is, it's quite interesting because that element was quite active in the West German peace movement as well, but is then discussed under the heading of communism rather than under the heading of national sovereignty and national self-determination, almost. So in a sense, playing Woodrow Wilson back against the United States under President Reagan, where basically then Spain says we don't want to be part of an alliance that we have no influence over. And this is also interesting insofar as the whole model of democratization, we're thinking about it from that perspective, in West Germany was based on the assumption that the United States was going to be the guarantor of peace and security. And so it provided material security, material safety through the Marshall Plan. There's the Marshall Plan ideology and so on and so forth. And in exchange, West Germany allowed the occupation, the stationing of US nuclear weapons, under which in the end it didn't have any control. And this is a kind of, that kind of setting is one that is currently unraveling. It's been unraveling ever since the end of the Cold War, but we are now actually seeing this, partly driven by the policies of the US Trump administration, but also driven by civil society actors, because there is no consensus anymore for this kind of model. And it's kind of interesting because to some extent, the campaigns in Spain in the 1980s sort of prefigured that kind of moment already towards the end of the Cold War. So they, in a sense, they already played through the end of the Cold War as they were going to be integrated into the Cold War structure of NATO. So there's quite an interesting sort of dialectic here. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is emotions, but I don't want to talk about fear, but I want to talk about disappointment. We've got some really excellent studies on fear, more generally Frank Biese's study on German angst, or also the work by Susanne Schregel on places of anti-nuclear activism and the role that fear played in it. Benjamin Seaman in particular has called peace movements as agencies that deal with disappointments in a political system. But we've now got a really great study by the German historian Bernhard Gotto, who's actually highlighted how peace movements and social movements more generally have actually served as ways in which political systems deal with disappointments. So he has a sort of functionalist approach where he looks at how obviously peace movements express certain expectations and concerns that are not highlighted in the kind of mainstream political system. But he then also says that peace movements also have ways in which they deal with the emotions that come with the disappointments by, for example, creating communities, mostly locally. So he calls for studies of local and regional peace initiatives rather than the sort of national organizational histories. So the kind of finely textured local approach. Then also the kind of forms of the movement, such as marches, human change, also the music that's associated with them. And then other ways of forming communities, like talking to each other, preparing the protests, and so on and so forth. And also then going into other areas of campaigning, such as activism for the developing world, the sort of globalization or anti-globalization movements, or achieving different globalizations, where also means to deal with this disappointment. And one story that's usually told in the context of Germany, but also elsewhere, is that peace movements were simply reintegrated into society because their norms became part of mainstream political discussions. So you can, in Germany at least, show this by looking at the Green Party, which initially is seen as almost as an anti-system party in terms of its organization and goals, and then gets integrated, and now basically its ideas are mainstream in German political cultures. But also with certain ideas of the peace movements, you can say that German society has become more tolerant of social movement organizing. But Gotto says this is only half of the story, because if you actually talk to the activists, they didn't feel that way. They actually became disaffected with the elites in the organizations they also belonged to. So in the elites in the Green Party, but also in the Social Democratic Party or the trade unions. So it's another interesting topic is the links between social movement organizing and more traditional political organizing. And therefore, they had to deal not only with the disappointment of their peace ideals not being implemented, but also with the disappointment of the organizations they belonged to essentially abandoning them and going mainstream while they continued on. And he then sketches out a number of ways in which the activists dealt with that. And the interesting thing is, and I think from today's perspective, one of the most interesting things that comes out of this is that there was a sort of a small group of people who became completely disaffected with the political system and then went into conspiracy theory and into a fundamental skepticism of statehood. So you can see this, for example, with left-wing anti-vaccination activism during COVID. And this is now kind of overlapping with very far-right activism against the same thing, because they're against the state as well from a libertarian perspective. But it also overlaps with very often a violent anti-Americanism, plus a very, shall we say, pro-Russian attitude in domestic politics. And we now also have, and I would say enabled by this kind of disaffection, partly an alliance between the far left and the far right in German politics. And if we can just switch, this is my last. Oh yeah, this is just to show the community at Green and Common Peace Camp. So I just wanted to show this. It was a women's peace camp, but we see here is a kind of almost family setting as a way of engaging with the community. But I've got one last one, yes, and this is, you wouldn't guess it, this is from the webpage of the Alternative for Germany party, because they are now the party of peace, and they have appropriated Picasso's dove for this in a mimicry of peace activism. And they obviously think that they can appeal to a certain constituency, and part of that constituency are the sort of disappointed peace activists from the 1980s. Whether or not they then vote for the AfD is a different matter, or whether they vote for more left-wing parties. So Sarah Wagenknecht's party in particular is popular there. But there is this kind of interesting overlap and alliance of peace activism. And I think this goes back to the disappointment with peace activism. Now, this brings me to my conclusion. The former Catholic Center politician Rudolf Amelunxen gave a speech on the 6th of November 1946 in front of students and professors in Cologne, and he called it Barricades of Freedom. You must realize that the barricade on which you stand today is peace. That revolution can only mean reconstruction. We live in one world. Unity and freedom are indivisible. The flame above Nagasaki is a last warning. Amelunxen's exhortation highlights the complexity of mobilizing for peace between reference at once to the past and to the future, and to the status quo and overcoming it all at the same time. As I hope I've made clear, peace in 20th century Europe has resisted any attempt at neat classification. And I've obviously not been able to touch on all important issues, left out many problems and also geographical areas. Mobilizing for peace in 20th century Europe has been a fundamental part of politics in modern societies. But the struggles over life, death, and survival, the yearnings for peace, also testify to the frailty and fragility, not just of the utopia of peace, but also of modern society more generally. Crucially, the different versions of peace that emerged and that the various movements and actors have campaigned for, the different shapes the campaigning and the negotiations took at different historical junctures, and the varied and various hopes and fears also entailed competing visions of how to deal with the problem of political representation within mass society, both domestically and internationally. Future research might focus not only on the transnational links within Europe, but also beyond. I think this is one of the most exciting areas of research, is trying to link to what happens in European movements. You've written, Giulia, on the links to Latin American movements. Others here have done this too, and I think this is a really exciting development, perhaps especially between and among the countries along the Mediterranean, especially into Northern Africa. I think this would be especially interesting. will also require more and more finely grained studies of the social history of peace protests, in particular along intersections with questions of gender and race, as well as class, as well as the ways in which peace activism might be related to more problematic skepticism towards formal political processes and organizations. Both hopes and disappointments connected with the politics of peace in 20th century Europe derive from a very peculiar pattern of social time that is embodied in these peace campaigns. The memories of peace in the past and the desire to stop time in order to achieve stability, so this kind of idea of a 0 hour or as a turning point in time, as we've just had it in Germany, there's this discussion about Zeitenwende, change of times, fits right in there. On the other hand, a certain impatience towards the establishment of peaceful plenitude. The voices of disappointment and the permanent feelings of betrayal that have accompanied the processes of what peace is have resisted closure. This history has been, and will most likely continue to be, a story both of disenchantment and of never-ending hopes.
So many things. I have a lot of questions, but I prefer that you begin to ask if there are something that you want to stress, to analyze, or to say. So I'm going to break with a question. So at the end of your inspiring talk and marvelous talk, so we thank you a lot. You speak about the necessity to come over the transnational dimension and to connect the history of peace at a global level. And you speak about the Western Sahara, so and in relation with conscientious objections and anti-militarism. So you can add something about your research on this point, please?
Not very much, I'm afraid. So I got this from Cynthia Cockburn's book on anti-militarism, and she's interviewed some of the activists that were involved there, and there seems to be a kind of lead over of a separate activism to kind of campaign about the status of that territory in Spain in that kind of starting in the sort of mid to late 1980s. But I don't know more than that, but she has some details in her book. I'm not sure how reliable it is. I mean, she has obviously done interviews, but I'm not sure how representative they are of the kind of general milieu, more generally of the kind of activist milieu at the time.
Yes, I think. Can you tell your name and introduce yourself? Then I'm going to meet you, everyone. But if you can introduce and then your question.
Yes, hello. My name's Tiffany Ferry. I'm based at the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. It was brilliant, really fascinating, because my own research is concerned with the visualization of peace and the idea and concept of peace photography, but much more in kind of methodological terms and in the context of actual peace building and community peace building. So I was particularly interested by the visual aspect and historically of peace movements. And my question is, I guess, to both of you as well, is this idea of how peace is visualized historically in peace movements, and how much you've come across different symbols of peace. When I say different, there's obviously the classic symbols of peace, the dove, the CND sign, potentially anti-war protests, but is it fairly standard, or have you seen in different peace movements different kinds of or alternative visualizations of peace?
Yeah, I think Giulia is the expert here, but yeah, I'll try. I'll have a first stab, and then you can elaborate. So, yeah, there's obviously the C&D symbol that I showed. There's then the dove, but the interesting thing is the dove only comes really in the sort of 1970s, 1980s. It's used mostly by communist peace movements in the 1950s already. That's also the very specific context. There's some history about how this was developed. There's some writing on this. What I would say is what is really interesting for the 50s and 60s, especially in Britain, is how it's basically the lack of symbols of peace. Because they just have the abstract C&D symbols, but they have very little else yet. They talk about it, but it's really an empty space. And then in Germany, what's interesting, there's a great article by Benjamin Ziemann called The Code of Protest, where he goes through some mostly German posters, where he looks at how did peace activists, or how was this portrayed in posters, and he basically shows a transition from victimhood, which basically is quite similar to the kind of old idea of women as victims of war and then children as victims of war, and which shows the kind of skulls has very much still in the 1950s, the sort of 1920s, 1930s feel to it, to a more activist vision where actually the posters themselves show the activism and show the activism as both the purpose and the contents of peace. And so he shows that kind of symbol. And that goes beyond the kind of well-known symbols, because you can then see sort of demonstrations that show a very diverse society, show disabled people, show colored people, show women, show men, show people with prams, and so on. And this is then painted or drawn, and it's very colorful and not sort of black and white. So he shows that kind of transition. And I think you can, to some extent, also see this in the UK. Although in the UK you get then a lot of sort of the kind of Bruhl, the sort of skulls picture, who's the artist. There's one kind of famous artist, there was just an exhibition of his work in the Whitechapel Gallery, who did this kind of skull with the C&D symbol, and that was obviously quite a popular kind of symbol. But very often the symbol of peace then is essentially the violence of war, as opposed to the kind of positive content. And there would be real scope. I mean, you're doing this in your project for a sort of comparison, how the different symbols compare and contrast about in different countries.
Yes, I'm not going to speak a lot because I hope that there will be other questions for Holger, and then we can speak a lot about this. And I totally agree that the main point is that there is not representation, or there are some representation of peace, but also in the anti-NATO, for instance, murals or posters that you have in the web page. You can see that the idea of peace is above all connected, that is another important point, to the memory of war. And the different, maybe is this the difference between the different countries of Europe, the different experience of war that different countries, for instance, the Civil War is so present in the murals in the anti-NATO movement in the 80s, so it's a really important cultural element. In Italy, instead, we have the idea of the aerial bombing of the Second World War, that is another traumatic experience, and also in Germany, in Western Germany, that is part of the idea of peace. So the idea of peace is translated into the experience of war that these people had. So this is a major point that Benjamin Simon did in his article on the codes of protest. But, and I'm going to conclude also the thing that the visuals are not only icons and the semiotic analysis, but also artifacts that do things in some way. And so the movements use this visual dimension in order to create emotions, to generate some impact in media. And so also we need to look to the performative dimension of visual, not only, I think, icons and iconography. So now I'm trying to move to this direction. But I don't know if there are more questions. Yes.
Thank you very much for these presentations. My name is Isaac Portilla. I am at the St. Andrews University. This question is for Professor Herling. You were mentioning about framing the history of peace in the 20th century, not opposing the war, the first half of the century, as with the second, because of the Cold War and so on, but looking more at the history of democracy, which means looking more at the way human beings interact with each other. I'm linking that with the idea of how pacifist movements work, that you were also mentioning is kind of a communal activity. There is some sort of attachment to the way people interact and live and aspire to a world that they are envisioning in a particular way, but they are enacting through their own activism. And that somehow comes into conflict with the way a democracy that is also a dialogue works at the social level, which is also very interesting with the last part of your presentation, because this frustration, when you see that your own dialogue or concepts are hijacked by democracy, by a different type of dialogue that is more inclusive in a way, you become frustrated, and then in a way you regress, and you are going to some sort of extremes. At least some people become disenchanted. They don't really want to belong to a larger society. They really are envisioning a different type of world, maybe small communities and so on. So I'm very interested into your vision about how this dialogue about peace is kind of a dialogue about types of communal living. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I think this is exactly one of the kind of interesting things where research could be going. I mean, you've done this, Giulia, in this article in Archiv für Sozialgeschichte, where you look at the way in which kind of local peace groups in Spain actually create a community in the transition from dictatorship to democracy in Spain around the issue of peace. And this is something that we still lack for example, Germany from that perspective. So there are now some kind of studies on peace camps. Also for Britain, there are studies on the Green and Common Peace Camp, etc. But we don't have the studies that link this to the sort of broader culture of activism in specific urban communities or also rural communities. Is actually quite important, because some of the protest sites were very remote. They were in rural, so I come from a small town in southwest Germany, which is very close to one of the protest sites, Mutlangen, And this is basically a complete backwater. But you then find pockets of activists who develop their own communal living. And it would be really interesting to kind of look at how they organize themselves and how that relates to their broader sort of aspiration. I think that conflict cannot be solved in the end, but it shows a particular problem that peace activists have, because they say our ideal is universal and applies to everyone and everything, and we are potentially, therefore, including everyone. But, of course, as soon as you build a community, you've got an exclusion, because if you don't exclude, you don't have a community. You need to have a boundary, otherwise you can't, you don't have a society. Every society has boundaries in some shape or form, and peace activism has a particular problem with that, because the ideal is universal. If you're a nationalist, you don't have a problem with boundaries, because that's the whole point of forming a nationalist community. So you can form a far-right community, and then you can define we're excluding certain kinds of people, and then there is a certain logic to it. But then for peace activists, it poses a particular problem, and then especially what you said, that some of the peace ideals are adopted basically by the other side, that's then even more of a problem. Because on the one hand you have the universal scope, but then someone else uses this for particularist and nationalist ends. But I think it cannot be resolved in a kind of normative way, but it's interesting historically to see how this played out at given time periods in a given country. So I think this is a really good point for further research that you raised.
I think that we have the time only for the last question, because we are on delay, and this is the first.
I don't know if this is working. Yeah. Hi, I'm Alba Martinez from the University of Leeds. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk. I had a kind of general question. I'm working at the moment on British women who were involved in the refugee relief campaigns in the 30s and 40s, in humanitarian campaigns in general at the same time. So most of these women were pacifists at the same time. And I was wondering, from your point of view, which have had the contribution of humanitarianism, and I mean by that the working on the ground experience, to the history of peace activism in the 20th century. I know it's a kind of big question, but just to know your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, I could do a whole talk on this if I had the knowledge to do it, which I don't. But I think this is a really interesting question, which is a very important question, important topic to work on, because it takes us away from just looking at the peace organizations, but looking at specific activities that arise out of them. And we have various instances where this actually happens. So the 1960s are usually remembered for the sort of anti-Vietnam War peace campaigns, but there was actually the largest mobilization in terms of numbers in the UK was the campaign about Biafra, about the civil war there, which is almost forgotten in public memory. Like, very few people talk about it. The activists talk about it, but it's not really remembered. But those campaigns are very often specifically connected to concrete actions in terms of alleviating the fate of the refugees, or in terms of organizing support networks, etc., etc. You could do a study on, for example, the whole support activism for the Republicans in the Civil War. I mean, this has been done, but there's more research ongoing on that, which is also very often related to peace campaigning. And this is partly where, for example, E.P. Thompson's biography comes from, because he was sort of, to some extent, involved, but also not involved in those kinds of discussions in Britain. Then also during the Second War, you have a number of, so Quaker relief efforts are very important. The Quakers, very small group, but they were basically everywhere. They were there for the reconstruction of Germany, 1945, as part of the sort of United Nations relief efforts. Quakers played a huge role, and they then organized some of the reconciliation efforts as well between Britain and Germany, for example, but also in terms of other countries, very important also for US activism. And of course, you then have a sort of almost global network as well. So I think that there is a relationship, and it's a very important one. And it basically shows exactly the kind of need to go beyond the sort of narrow conception of just looking at peace organizations that have basically peace in the title, where you then say, okay, it's the Peace Pledge Union, so yeah, that's peace, but everyone else isn't. But to actually look at some of the intersections with other campaign groups as well.
Maybe the last one? Or no? So we can thank you. Oh, Laura won. Okay.
But I'll try to do it. When you mentioned Tony Judd before and his idea of peace in the Eastern countries as a tool of propaganda, and I think we are beyond this idea. And what I'm interested, I was before speaking with you about the idea how peace help in that moment, in front of what Tony Judd said, how peace was important and pacifism was important in the developing on human rights, and in the country where dissidents were working against the Soviet Union model. So after Helsinki, how pacifism was an important tool in terms of democratization of this country. I know that this is a huge idea, but just what I want to ask you if we can think peace not only like a contraposition to violence, but in that moment, peace as part of human rights. So first time maybe, peace not in front of war.
Yes, so that's a very important point. I mean, there's sort of two parts of my answer. The first is that there is a huge debate going on at the moment to what extent actually the breakdown of Eastern European socialism or dictatorships was actually caused by civil society activism, because some people said it was just systems breakdown and there were very, very few civil society activists around. And then a lot of people later said, oh, I was on the barricades, but they weren't really. So Ilko Sasha Kowalczuk has basically made that point where he said there weren't, I don't know anyone who did this. Like I was there, a few others were there, but no one else was there, even including many people who said they were there. So that's the first thing. But if we accept that it mattered, I think this is a really important change that happens over the course of the 1970s, and I think doesn't just happen in Eastern Europe, it also happens in Western Europe, especially, and this is quite interesting, in France, which didn't really see much independent peace activism beyond the Communist Party. And the language of human rights actually now creates something that opens this up in the context of the debates of the 1970s. There's also a strand in the UK that goes via the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundations and the engagement with the peace process, or the violence at that time still in Northern Ireland, which also uses the language of human rights already to make a point about ending the conflict. So there's also a transnational component to this. But this is also something that is already taken up by activists in 1980s West Germany, some people in the Green Party who basically say, including some of the most prominent voices now in the Green Party who are still around, Joschka Fischer, for example, who already said, and I found some fascinating stuff from Green Party discussion minutes, where he basically says, you know, this is utopian stuff, we need to talk about human rights, in the late 1980s. And this is basically then a split that happens within the West German movement over the discussions in Eastern Europe, which actually permeates discussions to the present day. Because some of the debates that are happening, especially in Germany, very controversial discussions about what to do about Ukraine, have to do with that. Because the Social Democrats, they still adhere to the kind of old West German ideal of anti-militarism, you know, Germany as a peace state, etc. Whereas most of the Green Party elite basically have followed Joschka Fischer, even when they're on the left of the party, to say peace has to be about human rights. And that then means that we have to be able to defend human rights with violence, i.e. with force. So in short, I would say, yes, there is a very important context to this. And it's actually the language of human rights. I mean, you could almost say that the human rights protests in Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany in particular, were the kind of functional equivalent to the peace protests in West Germany. So if you do a comparison, you would do the comparison not between peace activism and peace activism, but peace activism, human rights activism. And that might also be one avenue to globalize the whole thing, because you then might be getting some interesting findings for the global scope as well.
Okay, so many thanks. Another time, Professor Nehring. So we can stop this first keynote speech, and another time, many thanks.